spot in the end there if you want. Was there someone there? Somebody sitting there. Good evening. Welcome to the July meeting of the Space Association. Thanks for coming. My name is Peter, the President of the Space Association. Michael Abdel here is the Vice President, and we've got the various committee members and Space Tragics along tonight as well, and a few new people, which is lovely to see. We've got a really packed night tonight, so I'm going to zoom through things. Excuse that. So we had a very big month, and the guys in the Space News area, one of which is not here yet, she will be coming soon, that will give you the details about that. And there's somebody here that will talk directly about what's going on here. So stand by for that. Okay, so our program tonight, we've kicked off just now. We're going to do a bit of news about what's been happening in the association, as we normally do. We then have our monthly feature, which is the last episode tonight because Apollo 11 has gone. And we've been doing a series on that. And then we're going to have a little bit of a feature after that, if we get time, just a bit about the mission and what happened afterwards. Then we've got a special presentation by Blake Fuller on the ACRUX-1 flight to orbit. Fantastic stuff. Melbourne Space Program. Then we're going to have a break for socialising, and this is an opportunity to get up, walk around, try to say hello to somebody you haven't met before. There's a big variety of people here, from scientists, flight attendants, plumbers, engineers, I don't know, lots of different people and lots of different backgrounds, so that's good to have. And then we're going to have our Space News, which is what we do every month. We do a roundup of industry updates with Angelo, he'll be here shortly, and Planetary and Science update with Rennie. And then they'll throw us out in the car park at 10, although they're not too bad about that, so you can hang around and have a chat. So just going to whiz through this. Obviously we're in the middle of the 50th anniversary. The association was heavily involved with the Sun Theatre in Yarraville, and this is ongoing now. This is their Moon Film Festival. It finishes on Wednesday. Got a great range of movies there, and it's not just Melbourne; it's around the country and over in East Timor as well, Timor-Leste. So they're getting their space new information up there as well. So we had this event yesterday. Many of you, or some of you, were there, and seemed to go pretty well. Everyone seemed to be happy. We've done it, so that's in the bag, so I'm not going to labour on about that. We had, according to our calculations, 161 guests there. We sold 58 of our T-shirts, and we had the US Consular Chief, Daniel Fennick, along as well, and he had a great time. Stayed right to the very end, because it was a long afternoon, and we were very pleased at how many people did stick around. Rennie did a presentation at the Glenroy Library, which apparently did very well. The guys up in Canberra had their big event over the last 4 days. It culminated yesterday in their big lunch that they had there, which is, I went to the 40th, and it was a fantastic day, and I'm sure that this one was even bigger and better. So I'm not sure whether this ever got off the ground, did it, Len? No, they were talking about trying to get a...
They're still trying to get it off the ground, but that was the last thing they mentioned yesterday. They really want some support for that.
Right, yes.
But having said that, the ACT government was enormous. The ACT government bent over backwards, and the whole of Canberra went nuts for a week.
Fantastic, yeah. Yeah, Len was one of, I'm not sure anything else, but went up there for that, so we might hear from Len about that later. Ask him during the break. So they did that. They had their big day. I'm sure they're all exhausted, just like I am, and many of us are after our day yesterday. John Swanee, who is Melbourne-based member here, and he comes along. He was with the Carnarvon team back in the 60s. He went over to Carnarvon, so I haven't heard back from him yet, but I'm sure they had a great day over there. They were having a big 2-day festival there. We culminated our commemorative mug bonus for members last night at midnight. We closed that off, so we end up with a good response to that. Either you've got them already, or they'll be in the mail coming to you. So that seems to have gone well. We sold a few extras as well. Just for people who are not familiar with what we do and when we do it, we have monthly meetings here at this stage. Fourth Monday of the month is our formula. So if you're stuck, apart from December's a bit of a crazy month, obviously. So we don't. I think it's the 15th we've got scheduled in for that. And as usual, just a bit of an advertisement. We are a non-profit group. No one gets paid. It's all out of love and volunteer work here. So we do. Obviously, we have the meetings that you're currently involved with. We have the special events like we had yesterday, but we also have a weekly radio show which Andrew Rennie produces and presents. And that's been going for almost 30 years continuously. Andrew started when he was a teenager, and look at him now. Yeah. So this could be your future. And tonight is the final of our Footsteps to the Moon program. So we're going to get that onto it straight away. How about that? Let me just shuffle my what's the names here. Using the technical term, that is, of course. Where do I do this again? Here we are. All right, geez, working already. Okay, so basically what we've been doing since September of last year is looking back 50 years and having a monthly update on what's been happening. So we've called the series Footsteps to the Moon, the countdown to Apollo 11. I found this diagram online. I thought that was really cool, the F1 engine. So if you need to build one, this is a good place to start. And just this is a nice little graphic, just showing you the basically the physical sort of contortions that the guys had to do to get in and out of the lunar module. It's not a huge amount of space, and that hatch was barely big enough to get them through. And you probably hear during the commentary of them getting in and out, arch your back, twist your arm, whatever, to get through. So I don't think they had too much space for you on the surface because they mightn't have got back in. All right, so just once again, monthly update progress reports on Apollo 11, which we did on a monthly basis. We're summarising it we started in September, because in September of 68, they hadn't flown a manned Apollo spacecraft. And here they are, in July of the next year, they've done the moon landing. So it was a pretty incredible series of accomplishments and missions back to back. So once again, we're going to culminate in the Apollo 11. But first, we've got to do time travel. So this is a photograph taken by the Chinese satellite that was the relay station for the Chinese probe that landed on the far side of the moon. They looked back and took a picture of the moon and the Earth, which I think is pretty cool. And of course, in '69, Eagle was flying around the moon with the Columbia. So. All right, so we'll usually have a quick look at what's happening around the world. So I'll whiz through this. On July the 5th, the Rolling Stones performed a live concert. This was just after the death of Brian Jones, who'd quit the band in July. Yeah, so he died in a car accident just before the... July 8th, 25,000 American troops had to be drawn from Vietnam. Obviously, the Vietnam War was still going on pretty heavily. American nerve gas weapons were accidentally released from their containers by a crew of US Air Force members at the Kadena Air Base. Stuff you find out when you do this research. Injured 23 troops. Henry Kissinger basically blamed the accident on an unidentified Air Force officer whose aesthetic sense of exceeding his judgment. He ordered the troops to have all the canisters painted white. And some of the drums were punctured during a sandblasting that preceded the painting. Can you believe that? Sounds like an episode of Utopia. Anyway, that's what happened. don't sandblast your nerve gas containers. That's a good lesson for everyone to take home tonight. July 11th, David Bowie released Space Oddity, which I believe is a new version that the record company has released just to make some more money. I don't know how different it is. July 17, the New York Times published one of the most famous retractions in history. Noted that in January 13, 1920, the topics of the time commented the ideas of Robert Goddard does not know of the need to have something better than a vacuum against which to react. So basically they debunked the whole theories of rocketry. And of course, July 69 they landed on the moon, so they withdrew it. Which is
quickly, the 1920s editorial was scientifically horrific. What surprised me is that no academics of that day questioned it.
Oh, really? Yeah, well, many of the owners of that article went on to run Fox News, apparently. And the US President Nixon's speechwriter came up with a speech to be read in the event that Neil and Buzz, or even Mike, were not able to come back from the moon, which you can read. It's quite a nice piece of writing. Fortunately, it was never used. That was William Safire wrote that. July 21, Luna 15, an unmanned solar lunar probe crashed on the moon, and the probe was intended to scoop a bit of samples of lunar soil and come back, obviously to try and beat the Apollo 11 guys, to take a bit of the shine off their achievement. So it crashed. So things could have been quite different if that had happened. Be interesting to know. July 22nd, the major American cigarette manufacturers agreed to stop advertising radio and television after 1970 in return for assurance from the United States government that warnings on the side of cigarette packets would not be brought in until July 71. Did you ever see that film, Thank You for Smoking? It's a great movie. It's all about the spin doctor. And I love this ad. It's particularly relevant for us. You've got to get the honest taste for that space mission you're going to go on. Mind you, a number of the astronauts, including Pete Conrad, were avid smokers and very begrudgingly had to give up on their flight to the moon. They couldn't smoke in the spacecraft. So, if you're looking for a seat, there's a couple of seats around here. You can swing around the end if you're comfortable, or take the couch, whatever you like.
All the photos from Honeysuckle, and on the day, John Gorton visited. Everyone in the photo, including John Gorton, has a cigarette.
Yeah, yeah.
And the room was very small. It's about from me to you.
It's amazing. And now, if someone smokes on a plane, you basically hit panic stations, you know. Back then, everyone was stubbing them out on the floor and in the armrest. A TWA flight from Philadelphia to LA with 131 people was hijacked. There were so many hijackings happening back then. The two federal employees, so there was some air marshals had been put on with them, these prisoners, but they weren't allowed to carry weapons. So apparently this guy found a razor blade after being allowed to use the bathroom. After emerging from the bathroom, he seized the stewardess and held the razor to her neck, blah, blah, blah. So there you go, back in the good old days. Apparently you picked up a wrinkly brown paper bag from a seat. The Beatles, we always do an update on the Beatles. So they were, John Lennon crashed his car in Scotland. He wasn't a particularly good driver and he could barely see, apparently. He was a hopeless driver. And the boys were recording songs for Abbey Road album. All right, let's look at space. Apollo. The Apollo 12 spacecraft arrived at the VAB on the 1st of July. And then it was lowered, started stacking. They did the stacking on the same day, like this thing was cranking along. Top 10, Hair was at the top of the... Ballad of John Yoko with the Old Brown Shoe was on second, etc. Oh, what else was there? The Real Thing was Russell Morris. I think I've still got that single at home somewhere. Yeah. Interagency Committee on the Back Contamination agreed the designation of the MSc Director for Medical Research was an agent to impose quarantine application to the crew, the spacecraft and the return materials. He authorised to appoint persons at each location of the phase of the mission to be responsible to exercising quarantine. So this is July 2nd. I mean, they're going in a couple of weeks. Anyway, Apollo astronaut itching due to insulation in the command module. Apparently in Apollo 10 they had a bunch of itching that they reported, so they determined that there was some insulation in the tunnel hatch between the command module and the lunar module. The Russians were, or the Soviets were still cranking along on the July the 3rd. They had another flight, well, sort of a flight of the N1. After 0.25 seconds, it blew up. This is the escape rockets firing as you'd want them to do, but the rest of the thing was a total disaster. So many said that was the end of even slight hope they had of beating the US to the moon in Apollo 11. July the 6th, they participated the boys participated in a pre-flight press conference. The news media were separated by a biological barrier, and after the press conference, they had to walk out with his mask on. I thought it was a nice picture. And once again, things were happening really late. The decision about taking a flag to the moon was actually done quite late, to the point where the procedure to deploy it and the checklist that was sewn into the boys' suits, they didn't even make it onto the suit. So they basically had to do it with very little training and very little preparation on it. Oh, here we go. Is it going? Is it gone? Is it gone? Is it off the pad or what? Now that I'm interrupted. Well, it was. No, we'll keep going. Can you click to it? Is it on the pad now? Or? It's about to go. All right, we're just going to break for a breaking story, which is this Indian. अंतरिक्षयान को चंद्रमा की कक्षा में पहुंचाने के लिए उसकी लिक्विड एपोजी मोटर को फिर से चलाया जाएगा. Steady state thrust of about 1700 kilonewtons together. The stage is 21.2. Oh, it's already up, is it? And has an outer diameter of 4 meters. It's already gone. 200 seconds. Oh, we'll kill that. About 10 minutes. 30 tons. Stan, sorry about that, guys. We had it in the back of our mind, but I didn't even think of it. Maybe we can watch it in the break. Oh, let's keep going. Right. Okay, let's keep going. So basically, this is the flag, which was actually attached while the spacecraft was on the pad. They went up late one night, about 3 a.m. apparently, to attach this to the side of the lunar module ladder, as well as attaching the plaque as well. So this is the contraption here. This is how it works. And breaking news: there was no wind on the moon, so they had to put a rod up the top to hold it sideways. That's you can tell things about. You can sort of waving around here. Well, physics. It's all about physics. Apparently, they went out to a bunch of different stores and bought half a dozen different flags and just selected one. They didn't want anyone to take the credit of being the flag on the moon. So apparently they bought one from Sears and other places. So, yeah, interesting. So July 9, Buzz was in a training aircraft flying different kind of parabola. They often use these aircraft for zero-G training. So obviously they configured the parabola to have the 16G, which we'd have on the moon there. So I think they were probably practicing getting out through the hatch and going down the ladder, etc., in the 1.6 gravity environment. So here's the. Oh, okay, there we go. This is the plaque that was created for the mission, and this is the area that was going to be attached on the lunar module. Once again, inside the what do they call it? SLA, something adapter. Okay, July 8, an effort to stem the increasing number of human errors found in flight hardware. They appointed a spacecraft walk-down team to take a first-hand look at the spacecraft as late as possible before delivery to the Kennedy Space Center. So they were having real issues about the quality of the spacecraft that were coming to the Kennedy Space Center. So they're hoping that was going to improve the quality, etc. They expressed belief that they were going to be able to reduce the costs of these. Very nature of the program, that is one of the operating in a research and okay, you read it. I'm not going to read it all. This is an interesting little one. Once again, for this was a NASA photographer, and they went in and got blood samples to check that they were going to be healthy and not infect the astronauts when he was in there doing photographs for the final departure to the. Now here's. Now I know someone's going to know this, but it might be a few other people. Here's a picture you had to ponder. Anyone know who this bloke is? He was born in Australia. There's a clue. Philip Chapman. This guy was an Australian-born. Melbourne-born. He was born in Melbourne, and he got selected. He became a US citizen, but got selected to be an astronaut in the Apollo program. Never flew, but.
He was on the Apollo 14 science support crew or something.
Yeah. So he was the first foreign-born US astronaut. So, and here he is at the launch of Apollo 11 on the 16th. 28th of July, this is obviously after the mission, to guard against cannibalisation, misuse and destruction of any part of the lunar mission support equipment, they developed these bunch of protocols. All recovered items will be identified and recorded, placed in secure storage, no removal without permit. Damn. Non-destructive testing would be permitted. Items returned to contractors for testing would be under bond, although I think a lot of that disappeared as well. And they, I don't have a date, 29th of July, they released, this is after Apollo 11 had come back, this was the plan for the missions for the remainder of the program. At that stage, they were still going to be flying Apollo 20. As we all know, these last three got killed off by Nixon. Apollo 18 went up, yeah, okay. Tim's relied beam. There was a documentary, wasn't there? Yeah.
There was a documentary.
Yeah. But it's some pretty interesting locations they're going to go to. All right, how am I doing on time, by the way? I think I'm doing pretty well, aren't I?
22 minutes past.
Oh, beautiful. All right, so this, I think, is a beautiful photograph. This is taken by Buzz looking up at the lunar module with the Earth in the background and in the sky. So I thought it was really nice. So we have to now travel back to 2019, everybody. So this is our 1969 newsreader. And now we're back in 2019. How we've fallen. And that is the end of the series. Now I know these are Gemini for you purists out there, but I couldn't resist using these are the guys that used these on the last Gemini mission, but I couldn't resist using it. So this was part 11, appropriately Apollo 11. So I didn't plan that, but it worked out that way. All the episodes are on our YouTube channel, so you can watch the whole lot. Each of them goes for about a half an hour, and our YouTube channel kind of looks a bit like this. So we've got bunches of features. We've got it's in a playlist here. There's a playlist there for that, and we've got interviews and things that we've done. We do weekly podcasts and things like that. So just go to that, go to the playlist, and go and follow that. So our next meeting is August 26th. Maybe this thing will be flying. They did a drop test and it's not powered. Angelo, where's Angelo? They'll give us an update on that soon, I think. So this is an orbital system that the Virgin company are developing, Virgin Orbit. Okay, so probably don't have time to play all of this, but I figured we've probably all seen the Saturn V going up, Neil and Buzz walking on the moon, all that sort of stuff. It's been a big, big week. Rather than me giving you a package of all that stuff again, I thought it'd be nice to just have a look at some stuff from pre-launch, pre-mission, and this is that video. Oh yeah, video. Thanks. And a little bit post-launch and recovery. As I say, we mightn't have time to go for it all.
In the lighter way here, you're now taking the trip of all trips of mankind. Can I ask each one of you, which place would you like to go to for a vacation when you come back to Earth? Well, I think that the situation being what it is now, the place I would most like to go immediately
is a linear receiving laboratory. If I'm able to go there, we will have succeeded.
We'll now hear from Neil Armstrong.
After a decade of planning and hard work, we're willing and ready to attempt to achieve our national goal. This is possible because very many Americans across the nation have dedicated themselves to quality, craftsmanship, and ingenuity. We're dependent, too, on the successes of the previous flights, the unmanned flights and the manned flights, Apollos 7, 8, 9, and 10, whose crews have done a magnificent job of preparing the way for us. I'm sure this American ingenuity and American craftsmanship has given us the best equipment that can be made available. And we're very happy to be ready to fly. I guess we're ready for your questions.
Thank you, Neil. We have a panel here of 4 newsmen who will ask questions of the astronauts this evening. These 4 panelists are representative of the more than 3,000 newsmen who are here to cover the Apollo 11 launch at the Kennedy Space Center. The first question we'll have from Mr. Walter Cronkite of CBS News.
Well, gentlemen, out there at Merritt Island, you all look very relaxed, and I assume that you're all quite confident. But I remember, Colonel Aldrin, that at Houston at a news conference last week, you had some concern that the public might be a little overconfident. You suggested that the shouting ought to come after the mission and not before it. Do you feel that the public is putting too much hope on this landing on July 20th?
I feel that we're seeing about the type of reaction that many of us were hoping for, and that is a very enthusiastic public that has great confidence in what our nation stands for and what our space program's aims have been, and what we hope to carry out in a few days for that American public.
Do you think, Colonel Aldrin, that perhaps we ought to use if a little more in describing the flight, the timeline here, instead of, say, when you land on the moon? Are there still a lot of unknown quantities in this thing?
Oh, I don't believe so, Walter. I think we're quite able to use the term when. We certainly are thinking positively. We've been thinking positively over the past many years in preparing for this flight, and of course in the last several months everything that we've been doing has been very positive in its nature, and no, I think we're quite well suited to say when we land, not if.
Next question from Mr. Al Rossiter, Jr. of United Press International.
Mr. Armstrong, there has been some concern in the past about Apollo crews becoming too fatigued by intense training in the final weeks before launch. How do you feel at this point in time?
Well, it's certainly a very hard preparation time in getting ready for flight, and we have been working hard ever since our assignment to this Apollo 11. However, our pace has certainly not been unreasonable, and we think that we're certainly not unduly fatigued, and we're ready to fly.
Next question from Mr. Everett Clark of Newsweek magazine.
I'd like to ask Michael Collins, the forgotten man of Apollo 11, if he can tell us exactly what he expects to be doing up in that command module at the time that Neil Armstrong steps out on the lunar surface.
Well, primarily just tending the store, Mr. Clark. As you may realize, the command module is a very complex vehicle, and just to do nothing inside it requires a good deal of switch throwing and a certain amount of attention. So I expect to be keeping the command module ready for Neil and Buzz's return the next day, and I'll be quite busy doing that.
Next question from Mr. Joel Shurkin of Reuters.
This is for Mr. Armstrong. There's been speculation about what the first man on the moon will say when he gets there. Will you prepare something ahead of time, or will it be prepared for you, or can we expect a spontaneous exclamation?
Well, certainly nothing has been prepared for me, and our attention during the training period and up till now has been focused on how to do the job and how to do it best, and not so much with what might be the emotions of the moment. I think that would be impossible to predict, and so I do not plan to guess at this point what my emotions might dictate, if anything. As a matter of fact, I think perhaps the highlight for those of us in the limb will probably be a successful touchdown. I really look forward to that the most this time.
Mr. Cronkite?
Neil Armstrong, I'd like to explore that a little further. I'm sure that old boy will be an understandable reaction when you put down there, but the world probably is expecting a little something more than that. Magazines have done articles about it, and there's great speculation. You must have had thousands upon thousands of suggestions, and some of them from some pretty high places, haven't you?
Well, we certainly have had a large amount of mail from the very interested public, and it's a great pleasure for us to find that the public is so interested in the details of the program and its various facets. I think this is one area that's probably captured the imagination of many people that are better prepared to look at this sort of subject than we are, but we really haven't had the time or opportunity to give those suggestions the attention they're due.
Haven't the public relations people suggested anything to you, Neil?
No, they haven't.
Okay.
Mr. Rossiter?
Colonel Aldrin, would you be satisfied if...
I want you to know that I think I'm the luckiest man in the world. And I say this not only because I have the honor to be President of the United States, but particularly because I have the privilege of speaking for so many and welcoming you back to Earth.
It splashed into the ocean. The Hornet was still 13 miles away. Navy frogman John Wolfram's team, Swim 2, was 10 miles away. It looked like Swim 1 would do the rescue as they were already at the splashdown site. However, the huge waves turned the Columbia capsule upside down. It took several minutes for the airbags to upright the module. This gave Swim 2, the designated rescue team, time to reach the capsule. Wolfram was the first man in the water. His job was to attach the sea anchor to stabilize the capsule. Once completed, he signaled Wes Chesser and Mike Mallory. They jumped from the helicopter with a 200-pound flotation collar. Together, all three positioned the collar around the capsule, then inflated it. The first raft was dropped into the water and inflated. The second raft was now dropped into the water and inflated upwind according to NASA's instructions to protect the frogmen from being contaminated in case of moon germs. They were required to use their open scuba gear during the process for protection from possible contamination. Clancy Heidelberg then jumped into the water and climbed into the second raft. The helicopter returned to lower Heidelberg's biological isolation garments and canisters of chemicals for the decontamination of the capsule and astronauts. Every precaution was taken to protect the outside world of any possibility of moon germs. Once Heidelberg had donned his isolation garment, the raft was brought aside the capsule so he could enter the first raft. Wolfram, Chesser, and Mallory then went back to their upwind location in the second raft while Heidelberg gave the astronauts their isolation garments to put on. After the astronauts donned their biological isolation garments, BIGs for short, they entered the raft to be washed down with the chemical solution. Heidelberg had difficulties with the hatch door and the astronauts helped him secure it. Once closed, Heidelberg sprayed down the space module with his chemical solution. After the capsule was washed down, Heidelberg washed down the astronauts. Helicopter 66 prior to the Apollo 11 mission also picked up Apollo 8 and Apollo 10 astronauts and later made Apollo 12 and 13 recoveries as well. As the recovery progressed, the sea state abated. Helicopter number 66 appeared above the capsule for extraction of the 3 astronauts one by one using a Billy Pugh net, named for the man who designed it. Wolfram, Chesser, and Mallory in the upwind raft then returned to the capsule and secured their raft to serve as lifeguards in case the astronauts were in need of help. As the recovery progressed, the sea state abated. Mike Mallory was given 5 cameras to take pictures for the Navy and AP press pool. He gave Wolfram one of the cameras to help him take pictures from the raft. Chesser stayed in the water as a precaution for the astronaut's safety and to help with the Billy Pugh net if needed. This made the task a little easier. The Apollo 11 command module had traveled 952,700 miles in 8 days, 3 hours and 19 minutes, and landed just 10 seconds behind the flight plan time within 1 mile of its target point. When the astronauts disembarked their helicopter, they immediately entered the mobile quarantine trailer. President Nixon soon arrived to greet them.
President Nixon waving to the astronauts. The curtains have been drawn. There they are in the rear window. President signaling for applause from the crowd. Astronauts gather in the window. Neil, Buzz, and Mike, I was thinking as you know, as you came down, and we knew it was a success, and it had only been 8 days, that this is the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation. Frank Borman says you're a little younger by reason of having going into space. Is that right? Do you feel that way, a little younger?
We're a lot younger than Frank Borman.
There he is over there. And come on over, Frank, so they can see you. They take that lying down? Are they young?
It looks like he has aged in the last couple of weeks.
Come on, Frank.
Mr. President, the one thing I wanted, you know, we have a poet in Mike Collins, and he really gave me a hard time for describing your words of fantastic and beautiful. And you were, I counted them, in 3 minutes up there, you used 4 fantastics and 2 beautifuls.
May our country, afire with inventive leadership and backed by a committed followership, blaze new trails into all areas of human cares. See our enthusiasm and bless our joy with dedicated purpose toward the many needs at hand. In the name of our Lord, amen.
Amen.
As the USS Hornet approached, Wolfram climbed on top of the module and held onto the reinforced loop. He made a 1960s hippie-like fashion statement by wearing bright yellow and orange flower decals on his wetsuit. A seaman shot a line out to the module and Wolfram attached it to the loop before jumping off the capsule. The capsule with its moon cargo was then hoisted aboard the USS Hornet. Mission accomplished. There are more videos and pictures at johnwolfram.com.
Hardcore space geeks like me, because you all sat there quietly watching that whole thing. Thank you for that. Just got a couple of minutes of the post-flight press conference with the astronauts, and then we're going to move on to our feature presentation. Only goes for a couple of minutes, I think.
We're ready now for question and answers, and wait for the microphone, and we'll go right down the line and we'll catch everyone if you'll just be patient. Time or two.
How much time did you have left in your life support backpacks at the time you got back on board Lem?
Updated today, and it's just not done what it's supposed to. It keeps going. Sorry about that.
I haven't seen the post-flight analysis of the numbers. We had roughly half of our available oxygen supply remaining in the backpacks, and somewhat less percentage in the water supplies, which is used for cooling. Of course, particularly on our first experience with the use of that backpack on the lunar surface, we were interested in conserving a good bit of margin in case we had difficulty with closing the hatch or repressurizing the LEM, or had any difficulties with getting the systems operating again in the normal fashion inside the cockpit.
Colonel Aldrin and Mr. Armstrong, when President Nixon made his phone call to you on the moon, it looked like the two of you suddenly stopped doing everything and stood there and listened and talked to him. It looked there for a moment like you might have been a little bit aware of what was going on. You weren't busy. Was there ever a moment on the moon when either one of you were just a little bit spellbound by what was going on?
About 2.5 hours.
I'd like to ask Neil Armstrong when he began to think of what he would say when he put his foot down on the lunar surface, and how long he pondered this the statement about a small step for man, gigantic leap for mankind.
Yes, I did think about it. It was not extemporaneous, neither was it planned. It evolved during the conduct of the flight, and I decided what the words would be while we were on the lunar surface just prior to leaving the land.
I'd like to ask Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but when you first stepped on the moon, did it strike you as you were stepping on a piece of the Earth, or sort of what your inner feelings were, whether you felt you were standing in a desert, or this was really another world, or how you felt at that point?
Well, there was no question in our minds where we were. We've been orbiting around the moon for a while. At the same time, we have experienced 1.6G before. We've been exposed to some degree to the lighting that we saw. However, this was, in my case, an extremely foreign situation with the stark nature of the light and dark conditions. And, of course, we first set foot on the moon in the dark, shadowy area.
It's a stark and strangely different place, but it looked friendly to me, and it proved to be friendly.
Some people have criticized the space program as a misplaced item on a list of national priorities. I'd like to ask any of the astronauts, how do you view space exploration as a relative priority compared with the pressing needs of the domestic society and the world community at large?
Well, of course, we all recognize that the world is continually faced with a large number of varying kinds of problems. And it's our view that all those problems have to be faced simultaneously. It's not possible to neglect any of those areas, and we certainly don't feel that it's our place to neglect space exploration.
There was a lot of discussion during the flight, during the power descent portion of the flight, about the program alarms and so forth. I wondered if you all could describe your thoughts on the subject, how it went, and what advice you might have to offer the crews of Apollo 12 and subsequent flights for this portion of the mission?
Well, I think we pretty well understand what caused these programming alarms. It was the fact that the computer was in the process of solving the landing problem, and at the same time we had the rendezvous radar in a powered-up condition, and this tended to add an additional burden to the computer operation. Now, I don't think that either the ground people or ourselves really anticipated that this would happen. It was not a serious program alarm. It just told us that for a brief instant the computer was reaching a point of being over-programmed or having too many jobs waiting for it to do. You know, a computer continually goes through a wait list of one item after another, and this list was beginning to fill up, and the program alarm came up. Unfortunately, it came at a point when we did not want to be trying to solve these particular problems. We wanted to be able to look out the window to identify the features as they came up so that we would be able to pinpoint just where in the landing ellipse the computer was taking us.
Buzz was carrying on a rapid-fire conversation with the computer at that point, but I think we really have to give the credit to the control center in this case. They were the people that really came through and helped us and said, continue, which is what we wanted to hear.
Sirens and whistles come from during the trans-Earth coast. I believe ground control had asked for an explanation saying it had come from the spacecraft. Secondly, I understand although low-angle lighting caused no problem walking around, there was a problem seeing obstacles in time when traveling at high speeds. I understand this might indicate the need for a flying machine rather than a rover for a long-distance lunar surface travel. Can you explain this?
We're guilty again. We sent the whistles and bells. We had a little tape recorder which we used to record our comments during the flight. In addition, play music in the lonely hours. And we thought we'd share that with the people in the control center. The sun angle was less a problem for the things you mentioned than the lunar curvature and the local roughness. It seemed to me as though it was like swimming in an ocean with 6-foot or 8-foot swells and waves. In that condition, you never can see very far away from where you are. And this was even exaggerated by the fact that the lunar curvature is so much more pronounced.
This for Mr. Armstrong. Had you planned to take over semi-manual control, or was it only your descent toward the West Crater that caused you to do that?
The series of control system configurations that were used during the terminal phase were in fact very close to what we would expect to use in the normal case, irrespective of the landing area that you found yourself in. However, we spent more time in the manual phase than we would have planned in order to find a suitable landing area.
Many of us and many other people in many places have speculated on the meaning of this first landing on another body in space. Would each of you give us your estimate of what is the meaning of this to all of us?
You want to try that?
After you.
Well, I believe that what this country set out to do was something that was going to be done sooner or later, whether we set a specific goal or not. I believe that from the early space flights we demonstrated a potential to carry out this type of a mission, and again it was a question of time until this would be accomplished. I think the
the relative ease with which we were able to carry out our mission, which of course came after a very efficient and a logical sequence of flights, I think that this demonstrated that we were certainly on the right track when we took this commitment to go to the moon. I think that what this means is that many other problems perhaps can be solved in the same way by taking a commitment to solve them in a long time fashion. I think that we were timely in accepting this mission of going to the moon. It might be timely at this point to think in many other areas of other missions that could be accomplished.
Well, everybody looking at me? Well, to me, there are near and far-term aspects to it. On the near term, I think it's a technical triumph for this country to have said what it was going to do a number of years ago, and then, by golly, do it, just like we said we were going to do it. Not just perhaps purely technical, but also a triumph for the nation's overall determination, will, economy, attention to detail, and 1,001 other factors that went into it. That's short term. I think long term, we find for the first time that man has the flexibility or the option of either walking this planet or some other planet, be it the moon or Mars or I don't know where. And I'm poorly equipped to evaluate where that may lead us to.
I just see it as a beginning, not just this flight, but in this program, which has really been a very short piece of human history, an instant in history, the entire program. It's a beginning of a new age.
That was a post-press conference after they came out of the lunar receiving laboratory. So, and Mike still got his moustache. All right, so that's it for me and the countdown to the moon, footsteps to the moon presentations I've been doing over these few months. Thanks for your patience in watching them. Now we're going to move to the 21st century, and I'm delighted to welcome to the podium Blake Fuller from the Melbourne Space Program, a steely-eyed rocket man right here amongst us. Something that he and his colleagues were involved with is orbiting the Earth as we speak. So Blake, you want to come up and introduce yourself, and welcome everybody. Welcome. You're on. You're on. And this is a laser pointer, and you're probably familiar with the laser pointer, being a steely-eyed rocket man, Rob?
That's what I am, sure.
Cheers.
Okay, so that's a little hard to follow.
If you could just stand here because we're streaming this as well. It comes through.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Am I using two mics?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. One's for the room and the other one's for the stream. It's pretty good, but yeah.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, yes, that's a hard act to follow, huh? But anyway, I'm here to talk to you about how the Melbourne Space Program, a student-run, not-for-profit organisation, successfully has just launched, designed and launched our first satellite, ACRUX-1, and how we did that over the last 5 years. So the Melbourne Space Program's a charity educational organisation. And we're about 80% student-run, 80% students, 20% people like myself, people with day jobs, unfortunately, working on the program. And the vision and the reason why the Melbourne Space Program exists really is to develop and foster the next generation of space pioneers. So a little bit about myself. My name's Blake Fuller. I'm the engineering manager at the space program. My day job's working at a company called ACRUX here in Melbourne. ACRUX is a product consultancy firm working in mainly medtech, but also consumer, industrial, and defense. So the majority of my job is working on things like exoskeletons there, life-sustaining medical devices, so things like artificial hearts, and cochlear products. So the Melbourne Space Program actually started off as the University of Melbourne Space Program. I've said here early 2015, but it's maybe even 6 months earlier than that. It's hard to know with these things. So it started off as essentially a student club. Back in 2015, the original goals were a bit hazy, but the club knew that they wanted to build a satellite. They knew they wanted to put something into space. They had a few ideas about technical direction. They had an idea about this self-inflating, highly directional antenna that they wanted to design. They were thinking about maybe creating this magnetorquer orientation control system. They wanted to start, design, and build and launch the satellite in 12 months. And they wanted to do it with 100% students. So that's all pretty lofty goals. I scraped through the Twitter feed and the Facebook feed of the program looking for all the photos. And on the left there's one of the prototypes of the highly directional antenna. Kind of looks like a horn. And that's George next to him holding onto one of the, basically a few dev kits strapped together. Hold it closer. Oh, okay. Great. And there's some dev kits of the original transceiver that George is holding there. And the 3D printed prototype there is basically the earliest concept of what they thought it would start looking like. So the club ran like that until probably about mid-2016. Mid-2016, the club actually separated from the University of Melbourne and became a separate entity in and of itself. And at that point, I joined around a little bit before that point, and mid-2016 is kind of after we split off. We sat down and we said, all right, this hasn't really gone anywhere yet. We really need to sit down and buckle down on what the vision of this program is and how we want to do what we're doing. And so I've laid it down here. Basically, the vision was we knew we wanted to develop a student-built satellite. We knew that the whole intent of this was to develop the next generation of space pioneers. And something that we're really snowballing on now with the space agency is to grow the sector. So from that, then we derived out for the ACRUX-1 mission what the mission objectives were. So partial success, and I think just going back to the original goals, it was about setting clear and achievable goals. Was clear. So partial success was literally just building and launching something into space. It didn't even have to work for us to claim partial success because we knew how much of a challenge it is to get something into space. Success for us was just receiving a single beacon from the satellite in orbit, which means it has to be up there and operating for us to hear from it. And then our stretch goal was 2 weeks of continuous operation in space, and also to validate the orientation control system that we'd built. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here for those of you who are technically minded. So with spacecrafts, there's 3 main ways that satellites point themselves around in space. Obviously, in a zero-G environment, it's a technically challenging task, right? The first way that most satellites use is called reaction wheels. So you get a weight and you spin it up, and then there's an equal force that pushes you back. It's a flywheel. The second most common is gas thrusters. So you've got a gas canister inside your satellite, you push it out in a certain direction, it spins the satellite in the other direction. You know, every action has an opposite and equal reaction. The third way is using something called magnetorquers. So magnetorquers basically use electromagnets to produce a magnetic field that pushes off the Earth's magnetic field. So you have to be close enough to the Earth to do this. So you have to know where in the Earth's magnetic field you are, and you produce an electromagnetic force against that, and it pushes it slightly. It only gives a tiny little amount of force in the order of micro nanometers, Newton meters. Sorry. So there's a little block diagram. Obviously, the Earth has its magnetic field. We detect where we are in that using a magnetometer. Then also from the Earth, we capture the heat signature of the Earth using infrared sensors. We take both of those through a Kalman filter and control them using a B dot algorithm, which we take, which also takes what's called a TLE. Basically, the ground station has to send up to the satellite where it is in orbit. And then from all that information, the satellite computes how it needs to push, and then it pushes, controls the electromagnets to create that electromagnetic field. And so magnetorquers have been used before, but what was new about how we'd done it was how we sense where the Earth is, and how then we can use that to point it in any arbitrary orientation. Okay, anyway, back to the story. So mid-2016, after that, you can still see the Uni of Melbourne logo here, but we got a new office up in Exhibition Street, kindly from the University of Melbourne. The team grew. There's a bunch of us here. Late 2016 to early 2017, we really started to buckle down on design, and we started to figure out how we wanted to solve these problems. And so on the left, there's the very first prototype that I showed you before, and you can see as it goes right, the design's getting more and more complex as we actually figure out how to design this thing. So mid-2017, team grew even more. This is in the same office. And actually at this point, we had about 60 engineering volunteers working on the program. So they're not all here. There are 60 engineers working on it, and about 20 extra people in the program across things like legal and marketing and comms and everything. Moving on, late 2017, we started to figure out exactly, well, what we thought exactly, how the science need to work to operate in space. So on the left there is one of the simulations of how some of the algorithms work, and on the right is our overall simulation space for how we're anticipating, how the heat affects us, and then how we can orient the satellite in space. Here's us experimenting in the lab. So on the left that's called a Helmholtz cage. So it's essentially an electromagnet, and you can turn up the magnetic field in it to simulate what the Earth's magnetic field looks like. So you can, we'd usually dial it up about 10 times stronger than the Earth's magnetic field, just to start accelerating the simulations and the experiments. And on the right there is the purple lights are simulating how much energy we'll get from the sun. Cool. So by the time early 2018 comes about, we've got a pretty good idea of how this thing will work. We've designed all of the pieces separately, and we're just starting to put the whole thing together. And this is an exploded view of what the satellite ended up looking like. So you can see there's 6 faces. Each face has solar panels on it. We've got magnetorquer rods in the center here. There's 2 lithium batteries underneath. We've got our 32-bit flight computer down the bottom. We've got a bunch of sensors on each face of the satellite, and then sensors inside the satellite as well. The transceiver on the top, and then just above that is our deployable antenna. And something I'd like to point about this is when we're talking about the goals, the primary goal was to have a student-built satellite. And so what usually happens in industry is the developer will buy about 70% of the components off the shelf. Everything that you see here was custom built by the students except the deployable antenna and the transceiver. Everything else was bespoke. So everything from the solar panels to the battery chargers to the power harvester to the flight computer, the electromagnets, it was all designed by us. We literally were wrapping those electromagnets by hand. We designed all the circuit boards ourselves. The mechanical chassis was designed by us as well. The only reason why the transceiver and the antenna didn't work is because when it came down to it, we wouldn't have actually been able to get the whole program together, but in time, if we had built them ourselves. So we had to pull it out at the last minute and put on the off-the-shelf unit. I don't want to talk about this too much because it bores me even looking at it, but you would not believe the licensing and regulatory requirements. It's unbelievable, especially before the Australian Space Agency was founded. It was very much fighting the battle ourselves. So the way that it ended up working is a satellite's classified as a defense item, basically. So you go through ITAR restrictions, and so we have to export our satellite from Australia into the States. We integrate in the States, and then the States ships it over to New Zealand, where we ended up launching the satellite. And then obviously going through frequency allocation and the human casualty analysis, proving that we're not going to hit the ISS and that we're going to burn up in orbit and not hit someone on the head. So that's about mid-2018. By about mid-2018, that was crunch time for us, and we'd really fallen into a good habit of running the project. We'd figured out how to do this thing. How do you get 60 engineering volunteers, who volunteer their time between 10 and 40 hours a week to come together to build this sort of thing? We'd fallen into our rhythm, and basically we built the whole organization around the question: what is the most important thing that I can be doing right now? And what's the most important problem that I can be solving? And if you're not solving the most important problem that you possibly can be, go and find that problem. And that's all we care about. We don't care about managing people or writing documents where you don't need to, unless it's solving the problem. So at that point, mid-2018 was the first time we went and did our pilot build. So we said, this is putting it together for the first time. So you can see there's a whole bunch of wires sticking out of this thing. You can see one of the magnetorquer rods in the middle there. There's the interboard connectors. The mechanical parts are strewn all over. You notice there's no solar panels on here. We had supply issues at that point on this sort of thing. But this is really useful because it's the first time that we'd actually started to put the whole thing together. After that, it was crunch time. When you put it together for the first time, you figure out what's wrong with it. So you find all the bugs, hopefully all the bugs. And so I was trying to think about how do I show a photo of everyone drinking too much coffee and not sleeping enough. And this is as close as I got. So there's some really cool shots. There's people outside testing the ground station antenna. This is again going through the solar tester, making sure we're getting enough energy from the solar panels, and just a bunch of time in the lab. Late 2018 comes around and we finally get to build the real satellite. So that's what it ended up looking like. You can see the batteries here. One of the magnetorquers on the outside. This is the flight computer up top. The SD cards go up there, and then interboard connectors here. And then so this whole thing obviously sits in the middle of the satellite. That's putting all the solar panels and the mechanical chassis around it. So that same experiment that I showed you before, this is the same thing running again with the actual satellite. So it's kind of the full loop closing, the end-to-end test closing, showing, this is the experiment of the thing we think of how it'll work with some prototype electronics, fall through to the final electronics and the final satellite. All right, we finished the design. We have to go and make it compliant and prove out to the launch provider that it's not going to blow up in a vacuum and that we meet all the environmental requirements. So there's one place in Australia you can do this, up in Mount Stromlo in Canberra, and there's one chamber. It's called the Wombat XL. And I had to include this photo because here's our little tiny CubeSat, our little 1U in this huge chamber, and they basically have to get that entire chamber down to the vacuum of space for our tiny little CubeSat. So there it is. So we were supposed to launch in December 2018. That got pushed back to January 2019, then February, then April. Delay, pretty typical. Until finally May came around and we got a solid launch date. So how do you get a satellite from Australia to the States? In hand luggage. So that's Rowan's taking it in a palanquin case on the plane. And then finally integrating it. So that's basically the pod where all the CubeSats, so that's a 3U pod, and that's Rowan integrating it into there. So there are two other satellites that sat on top of us. That's in here. Okay, so the big day, 29th of June. So I'm just going to pause for a second and just think about, the program had been running since late, mid 2014, early 2015, and we'd been seriously working on the engineering since about mid 2016. So we've been working on this for about 3 years of our lives, 3 serious years of our lives, and it came down to launch day, which I can tell you there's a huge amount of stress at this point. We're really excited, but there's a lot of stress. This is the Electron rocket. Rocket Lab was obviously our launch provider. They're in New Zealand. So we get to launch day. Launch occurs, launch is successful, we get to T plus 50 minutes. At T plus 50 minutes, this is an animation of basically what happens. So the kick stage deploys us out of the side there. and we got confirmation of, first, the launch was successful, and confirmation from Rocket Lab that the orbital insertion was all fine. And so I was talking about stress before. Imagine the stress of getting up to this point and then realizing that the rocket didn't blow up. Rocket Lab have done their job. They've done everything they need to do, and all of a sudden it's about us working and us doing our job properly. So our first pass occurs. So the first pass basically, the rocket deploys us about here, and then as it comes around to the ground station here, we get our first pass. And so your first pass is your best opportunity to hear from your satellite. You haven't been in space for that long, so thermal considerations haven't really started to hit your satellite. You're not too cold, you're not too hot yet. You've probably still got enough power from your batteries, so your solar system doesn't actually have to work. It's basically your best opportunity on your first pass. So the first pass comes up, and radio silence. We don't hear anything. And we're devastated at this point. We're thinking, well, we're not devastated. We're thinking, all right, it's fine. It's probably maybe a timer reset or something didn't happen. We'll wait the extra hour and a half, because it takes an hour and a half, obviously, to get back around Melbourne. And we think, okay, the second pass, I'm sure this will be okay. And thank goodness, we got our first packet. And so this is a screenshot of the engineering view of how we got that first packet. And basically, we coded in the message, to do, please tell MSP that their satellite works. Woo! And the ultimate irony of that is that on the day, our ground station actually didn't work. We ended up having a bug where obviously your ground station needs to track the satellite as it goes over, so it's got motors on it to do that. And as the satellite was coming over, someone got a sign wrong in the math. So the satellite's coming over like this, and our ground station's tracking like that. And the best thing about this is there's an organization called SatNOG. And SatNOGs are an amateur radio organization, basically of space enthusiasts who track amateur satellites in orbit. And I gave a talk here April last year, and someone in the Q&A section afterwards said, hey, have you heard about SatNOGs? They're this great organization that do this thing. I said, no, I haven't. And we ended up following up and catching up with SatNOGs. And then we said, hey, we're launching the satellite, and they ended up tracking the satellite for us on launch day. And the best part about it was, because we didn't hear from it, they did though. And the only reason that we heard from it on that day was because SatNOGs heard it. So the full loop has come around. So maybe I'll do more presentations.
Space Association had a vital part of this program.
That's right. You can claim it. So thanks to SatNOGs. Okay, so post-launch, so we had 3 or 4 days of really good data. We were going every pass. We were getting a lot of data from it, from the beacon. And frankly, at that point, we were saying, oh crap, what do we do now? Because in hindsight, my optimism was pretty low. But we were getting really good data. The thermals were really good. We were sitting at about 12 degrees Celsius internally, which is really good. We were charging properly. We're doing everything it should do. It was a bit too early to see how well the magnetalkers would work. Basically, we had to send a command up to it to request that data for it to come back down. But then after the 4 days, what ended up happening is we're energy negative, which we thought we would be. But energy negative basically means that you get less energy from the solar panels than what you use in the satellite. And we expected that. It just means you only operate in the sun. But it looks like we're going through some sort of boot loop. So it's running out of charge. Then as it comes up, it waits 5 minutes before the first transmission. And the first transmission happens, and then it's browning out and then resetting itself. And it's doing that. Classic, right? And so basically what we're doing at the moment is there's this ground station with SatNOGs in Europe, and we're getting them at morning time in Europe as the satellite goes overhead to send a sleep message. So we say, hey, go to sleep, go into low power mode, and then it charges up in the sun until it gets over to Melbourne. And then when it's in Melbourne, we send up a message saying, hey, turn on, please send me the data. So this is like huge international kind of operational challenge that we've got at the moment. But if that works out, we can continue doing that. We can automate that process and then continue getting more data and then look at the orientation control system. All right, so what's next? So ACRUX-1 was really a concept mission. This is the first time that an amateur organization in Australia has done this since 1970 with Oscar 5. And so there have been a lot of naysayers, myself included, thinking that there's a lot of things that can go wrong with this. So now that we've gone through this proof of concept, it's really about what's next. So the next mission's being planned. There's about 3 missions in the pipeline. Obviously, the next programs are going to be bigger and more challenging. We're going to align with the Space Agency and what they think they're going to be doing and what they think the direction in Australia should be, and solve real problems. So, in summary, 3 years of our lives, and the whole budget ended up being about $300,000. When you think about that, that's actually a phenomenally small amount of money to do what we did, which I think speaks a lot about where space is now. So 3 years of our lives, we're really actually developing space pioneers in Australia, and the reason that I say that is because all the students who are coming out of this thing, they're graduating with master's degrees and everything, and they're basically getting jobs before they can graduate at some of the best companies in Australia, and unfortunately some of them overseas. But they're really getting some of the best jobs. And now that we've done this once, it's a lot easier to do the next missions. And the way that I see it is, we started off with nothing, we got to here, and then with the framework that we've built up, we can do something even just that exciting again for the next mission. That's it. Thank you.
How easy was it to hitch a ride?
Oh, actually, so I can talk about this now. The last time I was here, I couldn't talk about it. So we went through a third party called Spaceflight. Spaceflight, basically the third party broker, you go to them and say, hey, I want to put my satellite into orbit. And then you pay them a commission, and then they put you on a satellite. So we were originally going to be on a SpaceX mission, SSOA, for those. We were actually originally going to be on that, but then we were going to be in a 600-kilometer orbit, which means we'd decay in 20 years. But there's a space law which says you have to be able to deorbit yourself within 25 years so you don't become space junk. And then we ended up they increased their altitude up to 620 kilometers, which put us over that law. So we had to change it. So with Spaceflight, because we were with this provider, they changed us to the Rocket Lab launch. I don't want to officially say this, but Rocket Lab are a fantastic company, and if you were going to do this, I would recommend going to them directly. Literally open up their website. You can go to rocketlab.com or whatever it is, and there's a button up the top which is Book My Satellite, and you click that button, and it's almost like going on Uber or something. It's just phenomenally easy. That company is definitely the future of this sort of launch. So now, if you went through that sort of thing, it'd be a lot easier.
So the $300,000 that you talked about, that includes the cost of the launch?
Mm-hmm. It included the licensing, the launch, the engineering development, the fees to pay all the government agencies that we needed to pay, the engineering costs, the flights to go over to all the pizza and the coffee and the beer. Yeah.
2 questions. How did you fund that? And also, is this satellite still up there? When will it deorbit?
It'll deorbit in 3 years because we chose that lower orbit. It's at 450 kilometers. And the first question, mainly from universities, but we offer a lot of value, as I think you can imagine. And so the first mission was mainly through universities, talking about the educational outreach. But in the future, I think it'll be very easy to justify the costs of the program for the amount of value the program delivers.
Of the subsystems you acquired, which were subject to ITAR, and also why was the system subject to ITAR in export?
So it's basically an ITAR exception. So because satellites are a defense good, you have to prove that you don't have defensive or offensive capabilities. We got audited almost. Someone from defense came and inspected the office to see if we had nuclear capability. And she walked in and she said, "You don't have nuclear capability." You have to do it. Because it's classified as a satellite is classified as a defense good. They have to inspect it to make sure you don't have something on there.
Apart from learning, as you did in the first one, is the Australian Space Agency looking to make the next ACRUX-2 more feasible, easier approach? Are they putting anything towards?
I hope so. I haven't heard. They're changing the rules apparently in September about how you go about the licensing. So for our export license, we basically had to talk directly to the Minister of Innovation to get that license. And so apparently they're changing that in September. I haven't heard about the logistics, but most of the challenge for us was just because we didn't have anyone who could tell us how to do this in Australia. And so what I'm hoping is that now that we've done it, even if the rules are still painful and long, at least then we can say, hey, here's our application, here's how we did it, and then point them in the right direction. Because 95% of your time is figuring out who to ask and what questions to ask. 5% of your time is filling in the forms and paying the money. It's figuring out what to do the first time. And so we've got this big checklist of all the things that we did. And so hopefully the next time someone wants to do this, we just say, here's our checklist, here's our applications, go and do the same thing. Hopefully.
I haven't checked recently, but 2 weeks after the launch, NORAD had not sorted out what the COSTAR and the NORAD number was for the satellites on that launch. Has that been done now?
So we know what we are because of the phase shifting, and the ground stations could pick out which one we were. But there was a mystery satellite on the launch, which is that what you're talking about? There was a mystery satellite that no one had identified. Rocket Lab hadn't announced, and that won't be identified. So there's a few things that they specifically won't. It's pretty typical. Rocket Lab launched defense satellites, right? So NORAD won't publicly identify what those satellites are.
So will the satellite actually deorbit to Earth, or will it burn up? And what data are you monitoring? Is it just internal data and testing the magnetic propulsion?
Magnetalker. The orbit decays in 3 years, so it'll ish. We're not deorbiting ourselves. We're just waiting for the orbit to decay until we burn up, and that should be in about 3-4 years. What data are we getting? So primarily, it's just about how well the system's working. So thermal data, power data, how well the software's working. There's basically a whole suite of sensor data that we get about the performance of it, and that's really how well have we built it. So then the next time when we do it, do we do the same thing, or what do we change about the next one? And then the other thing, obviously, is how well is the magnetic orientation system working?
What was the cost of the actual launch, and what's the weight of the satellite?
I don't know if I can say our exact launch costs, but it was about a third of the total cost. I found it very good to talk directly to Rocket Lab about these sorts of things. I can't even express how easy it was to deal with them when we needed to deal with them. So they almost said to us, for the next one, tell us what your launch costs should be. It was almost the discussion. Said, nothing.
And was it in New Zealand dollars?
What was it? No, because we went through a space flight, right? So,
okay.
Yeah.
And do they charge by the weight of the satellite?
Yeah, it's like going to the deli. Yeah, it is. You pay by, like, if you're 1U or 2U or 3U, there's an incremental cost for that. I think it'll decay, right? So if 1U is the most expensive per kilo, 2U is less expensive per kilo, but still more.
So what was the weight of your satellite?
1 kilo.
1 kilogram.
Yeah, it was 1U.
On the magnetalkers themselves, what is the intended use? Is the Earth's magnetosphere stable enough that using a magnetalker enables you to actually point a telescope, or is it more just to get in general orientation to change orbits?
So we're hoping we can achieve about plus or minus 8 degrees of precision, which isn't good enough for a telescope. It's good enough for anything but a telescope almost. If you want to point down at the Earth, or if you want to track a ground station, it's accurate enough to do that, but not for precision telescopes.
Was there a second chance? If that failed, was that it? Mission over?
Yep. Hence why we define partial success. Yeah. Yeah. Hence the stress, right? There wasn't a second chance to do this. We didn't have the funds to build a second one. We didn't have the funds to launch a second one. So I'm very glad it went well.
Like, when is the signal going to fail, do you think, on this current satellite you've got? Or has it failed already? Are you getting signals from this satellite?
We're not getting data from it, but we are, what we think we're seeing, it looks like we're seeing transmissions that have started, but we're not able to decode them. So if we can revive it with this whole Germany to here go to sleep mode, then it should operate for the whole 3 years. Yep.
And with the new, your new project, version 2, what do you hope to get out of that project compared to one you've got now? So what's your new project going to involve?
So the vision of the program is still to develop space pioneers, right? It's still to grow the sector. The specific mission itself, we haven't exactly nailed it down. It'll either be an Earth observation, so looking at something like climate change and effects on Australia's climate. There's a lot of interest in that in Australia, especially at the moment, around water monitoring and bushfire monitoring. Other than that, space situational awareness, so dealing with space debris. And there's a few different fields. The Australian Space Agency's outlined 3 main areas that they're thinking, and we're obviously going to align ourselves with that. We haven't defined the exact mission. Like I said, there's about 3 that are floating that we're still trying to nail down, and I think once we nail that down, we'll obviously talk about that, but I don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot until we've exactly figured out the mission.
How space rated was the electronics and things? Was it off the shelf, or was it nuclear bomb proof, or what were you?
So I started this program coming from life-sustaining medical devices, right? So 3 years ago, I came in saying everything needs to be radiation hardened, and we need a 3 microcontroller voting system because it's single fault redundant and coming in with a sledgehammer. What we learnt was actually the biggest risk to the program wasn't radiation, it was us getting something wrong, right? So because of that, we basically changed almost all of the architectures to deal with that main risk. So we made the flight computer incredibly simple. It's a 32-bit, it's an MSP 432, it's a 32-bit Texas Instrument chip, no radiation hardening at all. We've obviously got error checking on memory and things like that, like basic things. We actually originally had radiation shields as well. We had aluminium plates all around the satellite, but they ended up cutting some of the cable harnesses, and it was just a pain to put them together. And we said, it's more likely that we're going to break something because this is so complex. So we actually got rid of all the radiation hardening and radiation shielding.
So if you wanted a longer duration, that might come into effect.
And we're in a really low orbit anyway. We're only at 450 kilometers anyway. So there's not, if we're talking about probability, radiation is about a probability game. And if there's the probability is we'll get one in, 30 years, there's a higher probability that we're going to break something in the first 2 weeks of the thing when it's supposed to work. So that was actually really interesting. We got rid of all the complexity about radiation hardening because we said that wasn't actually really the risk. The real risk was us implementing a complex system and getting something wrong.
Leads nicely into this question. Was it a design issue that caused you to have not enough power to complete the full orbits, or was it components degrading, not being able to orientate yourself to the sun, or were you weight constrained and you just couldn't put enough performance on the satellite?
I can only really theorize what's happening now, and I will. But we thought we'd be energy negative. We basically only had we're basically spot on. We were where the constant power usage of the satellite in normal operation is about 1 watt, which is quite a lot. And we thought we'd be getting around 0.8 watts to 2 watts to 3 watts of energy. And that's basically just, so we thought we'd be energy negative overall. So obviously, because you're only in the sun half of the time and out of the sun half the time, you need to get at least twice as much energy. So we thought we'd be energy negative, but probably what's happening is it's probably just a software issue. So it's we're boot looping, and then the tracking algorithm so the solar panels have a tracking algorithm to get the energy from it. And I think what's probably happening is when we come out of that, it's there's not enough charge to kick in that algorithm quickly enough, and so we're not getting as much power during the boot loop. So what you do is just put it in a sleep mode, so it doesn't consume that power and doesn't make a transmission. We think that's what's happening anyway. Does that make sense?
How long before you find out whether that sleep is going to work?
So the funny thing about this is when we're organising this, everyone's got full-time jobs now. So the people who are trying to organise this thing with this guy over in Germany, we have to wait until our schedule allows it and his schedule allows it. We have to wait for exactly the right orbit, so it's going over just in the morning in Germany and then just in the evening over Melbourne, which is it's basically just a probability game until our orbit kind of all aligns. And so we've had, I think, 1 shot at it so far, and that didn't actually work out. It was just that we didn't logistically sort it out. It was kind of a dry run. So we're hoping in the next probably few days to week or 2 that will have a good opportunity. It's just almost a waiting game now.
Just towards the beginning of your talk, you did say something about the wider industry and what the ties were with the space agency and so forth. So, where do you see your organisation going next?
I think we need to align with the Australian Space Agency. They've set out outlines of where they think the Australian industry should go, and that's based on a lot of data and a lot of information that they've received. I think we'll align ourselves with that, definitely. But really the value that we add and the reason why the program exists is to foster the next generation. So then when things like the Apollo missions come around the next time, whether that be to this lunar gateway or going to Mars, that it's sustainable and that we've got a group of engineers and scientists and science communicators and everything that goes along with this, so that we build up enough people to sustain that. And so that's the overall goal. And so there's these three directives. They're saying space situational awareness, Earth monitoring, and GPS, I think it is. And they say that because they've got a lot of information. So obviously we're going to align ourselves with that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Blake. Let's put our hands together. That was fantastic. So we went from 50 years history, Apollo 11, to last month. So this is fantastic. This is what really is exciting for us in Australia. Thanks for coming out again. You're a serial offender now, so you're on the dance card for the next time.
All right, we'll have to do something cool for the next mission then.
Absolutely.
Excite everyone about it.
Thank you very much. We're going to take a break now, ladies and gentlemen. Stretch your legs, have a drink. Say hello to somebody you haven't met before. We do have a couple of things available for sale, some T-shirts and the Australian Space book, which is brought out by the Space Industry Association for sale. It's limited edition, so it's quite a good book. And if you haven't put your name on the sheet at the back there, there's a contact sheet. You just write your name, phone number, email address, and we'll put you on the mailing list so you keep up to date with what we're doing as a group. And if you're a member, a paid member of the association, come and collect your member mug tonight, because they're all sitting there ready to go. And we'll be back here at 9, is that correct? 9 o'clock. And we've got a special guest, almost directly from the US, via Canberra. And you want to stay around for this. This guy's amazing. Thank you, Blake.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks so much.
Welcome back, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Len Halperin. Now, I was going to say I had the honour and privilege to go to Canberra. That's not true. I made the decision to go to Canberra for the 50th because I had been up there for the 40th, saw the fantastic show that the Trackers put on, and I made a decision 10 years ago, if should they still be around and do a 50th, I'm going. So I went to Canberra, and I did have the honour and privilege to be in Canberra for the 4 days, and I had the extreme honour and privilege to be at some functions where the Trackers were and meet some very, very special people. Now, amongst those people was a gentleman I'm about to introduce to you. Now, we've all heard about the 3 tracking stations because we know 120 degrees, you've got to have Goldstone, you've got to have Honeysuckle, and you've got to have Spain, you've got to have Madrid. And it was really nice to see that the charge d'affaires of the Spanish embassy was at the function on the weekend. So Spain was represented, so we had the American flag, the Australian flag, and the Spanish flag. We know about the 3 ground stations. The key word is ground. The Earth is 70% water. So how do we cover all that other stuff? Now, all spacecraft communications went through the Goddard Space Flight Centre for Apollo. That's all the Goldstone stuff, all the Australian stuff, all the Spanish stuff, and the stuff over the water. There was an entire subnet running a tracking network over the water. They were the Orion aircraft. I have tonight the gentleman in charge of the Orion aircraft, the subnet Orion that ran through Goddard. I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Stan Anderson. Met him in Canberra, wonderful gentleman. I'll tell you one quick story. I said, Stan, ran Orion aircraft. Why are you in Australia? There must be a million things you could be doing back home this weekend for the 50th anniversary. He said, I'm a tracker. I'm here with the Trackers. I'm with my folks. So there you are. This is Stan Anderson.
Thank you very much. Well, make it brief. I had a privilege of, I was in the Air Force at the time. I was a sergeant in charge, actually the facilities manager for what NASA listed as their number 3 communications center. And the reason is because, as Len has pointed out, you're familiar with the Deep Space Network, the Honeysuckle Creek and Goldstone, which is out in the middle of the desert in California, and the station in Madrid. But they had 11 other stations around the world. And actually, if the satellite went over, they could track it for 6 minutes, because that's as far as they could see. But they also had 3 ships. All of those stations had 9-meter antennas. But as Les pointed out, they still had a big gap to be filled. And so they converted, at the time, of course that was the latest technology at the time, they converted, the NASA contracted with the United States Air Force to operate a fleet of 8 Boeing 707s that had been modified with a 2-meter antenna in the nose. And this 2-meter antenna was gimbal mounted, had great tracking capability. And before the mission took off, they would tell us where they wanted the planes and when they wanted them. And so we found ourselves flying out of, and particularly around the world. We would normally fly out of Ascension Island in the South Atlantic. We'd have 1 or 2 planes there, and then we'd flown out of Perth and Darwin and Townsville, Guam, Hawaii, Johannesburg, South Africa, Nandi and the Fiji Islands, Pango Pango, American Samoa. We just flew where they needed us. And it was my job as facilities manager, basically the facilities manager for our control center, which was at Patrick Air Force Base, which is about 30 miles south of Cape Canaveral. And then during the mission itself, I had my own console position. That's why we call it flying a console. And my job was to keep track of, make sure every airplane, how many of them were flying, and generally with the maximum we flew is 6, we always kept 2 in reserve, or had 1 positioned as a backup. And so part of the reason was that my job was to take care of the pre-pass checklist, and every airplane had a 14-point checklist, and it started about 50 minutes before horizon time. The airplanes had a couple of advantages over the ground stations. One was that we flew at between 30 and 35,000 feet, and so therefore, as a ground station, barring terrain masking, but a ground station, if the satellite went right straight over the top, could track it for about 6 minutes, which is about 1,325 miles. The airplanes, on the other hand, flying at 30,000 feet, had a much longer view, and we could track it for 10 minutes. And so what would happen is, and this was almost a standard procedure, they would, when invariably the word to go to the moon would be sent up through Carnarvon, and then they'd light the engine, and then by the time the engine turned off, the service CSM engine, or the S41B engine turned off, they'd be long out of range of Carnarvon. And the next ground station available was in Hawaii. That's a lot of area to be covered. And so what they would do is they'd put one, possibly two of the Araya aircraft up and fill that gap. And that way, as soon as actually it was an overlap with Carnarvon, they could continue to talk to the astronauts, find out how the engine burn went, and things like that. Another advantage that we had was that the ground stations were, well, if something went wrong and they had this delay efforts, you couldn't do anything with the ground station because it was fixed. But our planes could move at 500 miles an hour, and so they were very easily redeployed. Sometimes during a mission itself, because even though they knew where they had to be and when they had to be there, if something else went wrong, you could divert them on a moment's notice, and they could reconfigure. The aircraft themselves were little, like I say, they were miniatures of the ground stations. We only had a 2-meter antenna, so we were really used primarily for orbital work, and also for every single mission as it came back from the moon. We were the only NASA stations that could pick them up after coming in out of blackout. And what was nice, for those of you that haven't seen it, I highly urge you, this is the 2019 version of Apollo 11. For those, how many here have seen it already? Okay, for the rest of you, and I'm sure those that have seen it, when you step into that theater, if you go to it in a theater, you're leaving 2019. You're back in 1969, because every single frame of that 93-minute movie is original film. It's original film. It's a great movie, but right near the end was something that brought tears to my eyes, because you hear the capsule communicator going up, Araya, Apollo 14, this is Houston through Araya. Now, Araya is an acronym for, the airplanes were officially known as Apollo Range Instrumentation Aircraft. And like I say, they had 3 ships that fulfilled a similar function. So anyway, I had the privilege of working the console, or flying the console, for every mission from 4 through 14. Got all the highlight ones. And so, to give a good example of how flexible we were, on Apollo 13, after they got the astronauts set up in the lunar module, the first people they called were us at Araya Control. And the conversation went something like this, because I was sitting right next to the controller. They said, network, he says, Araya Control, this is network, he says, Roger, go. He says, where can you get the airplanes? We says, how long have we got? They said, 4 days. We said, any place in the world you want them. Well, we had tremendous coverage. In fact, actually, during Apollo 9, which was an orbital mission, we actually had overflight and landing clearances in 31 countries around the world. I mean, it was just that they could fly direct. An interesting thing is that a lot of them initially, they had United States Air Force, U.S. Air Force on the side of the airplane. And given the politics of the world at the time, because it was Cold War, that kind of upset some countries to have Air Force planes might be setting down in their territory. So they asked us if we could change it. And so literally what they did was they changed it and they put what was the diplomatic markings where they had United States of America across on the white top of the airplanes. And that way, if we had to land at some of these more sensitive areas, at least it wouldn't be so obvious. But hey, we were flexible. But I think before I open it up for questions, and I'm sure there'll be a few, one of the things I remember, because our planes were on the ground when they set down on the moon, because we couldn't track that far with our 2-meter antenna. Incidentally, of course, they had the 26-meter antennas at the Deep Space Network, and then they had about the time Parkes was coming online, and it was more brought up as a test situation rather than an actual. It wasn't part of the original picture when that big antenna. But one of the things I remember when we landed on the moon was Walter Cronkite saying, "Incredible, incredible, incredible." And I've long maintained that there is no single word in English or any other language that can describe what it takes to put a man on the moon. But I did have a conversation with our communications comtech up at the Cape. He was the guy that we would get, when we get the signal from the aircraft, we literally get it and run it out through a long wire through high frequency. And we had a couple of OTC stations here in Australia, plus a station in Guam and a station in Hawaii. And all of them were listening to this frequency so they can pick up what we're rebroadcasting, in this case the conversation between Houston and the astronauts. And they'd all go to Cape Kennedy, and then we have a man at Cape Kennedy that would select the best one, and he'd forward it up to Goddard, and Goddard would forward it to Houston. Boy, what a kludge. But anyway, I talked to Dominic because a question had come up on a listserv that I'm a member of, and we had a 15-minute conversation, and in that 15 minutes he mentioned the same 4 words, and I think it really encapsulates what it takes to put a man on the moon. And I can summarize it like this. When you consider the magnitude of the task that we were given to put a man on the moon and bring him back, and when you consider the state of technology at the time, when the only people with individual communicators or personal communicators were Captain Kirk and the crew of Starship Enterprise, and when you consider many of the real-time challenges that we had to overcome, because if a piece of equipment goes broke, you either got to get it fixed or find a replacement to get around the problem. And then the fact that we did it not once but 6 times can be summed up in 4 words. But we did it. But we did it. And so I like to point out that what NASA called their manned spaceflight network was, like I say, it was these 11 ground stations, 3 DSN, Deep Space Network stations, the 3 ships and 8 airplanes. We controlled 1/3 of their network, and with the airplanes. And so I like to look at it this way. NASA had their own, the manned spaceflight network that NASA had was really a very specialized telephone company. Now, how many people here know what goes on with the telephone company? The only time you do is when, oh, get somebody back there that must work for the telephone company. Okay, but the only time you worry about it is when it doesn't work. Well, that was our job. But the interesting part is here in 1969, we were wireless. Well, at least I didn't think there were any long lines running from that spacecraft when it went over. So, but with that, I'd be glad to open up for questions if you got some questions. If not, that's even better. I guess I completed my job. Yeah.
So during Apollo 11,
yeah,
where were you stationed and where were you flying?
Well, we were, like I say, we had planes flying out of Ascension Island. We had them out of Darwin, Townsville. I don't think we had any out of Perth on it. I know we had. I take it back. We did. We had 2 planes flying at Cocos Island, out of Cocos Island in the Indian Ocean. They were supposed to, but they had to move because there was a cyclone coming in. So I think they moved them down to Perth. And then when they returned, in the mean, what we would do is the planes would fly out to get them on their way to the moon, and like I say, they'd fill in the space up in toward Hawaii. Actually, it was kind of interesting on Apollo 11 because Orion 7 was a spare, and he was a spare sitting in Guam, and he's on the ground ready to go. But what happened was, and the reason he was there was this: it's because if they normally they gave the go-ahead for TLI, translunar injection, they gave that through Carnarvon on Rev 3. But they also had the capability, if something went wrong, to slip it to Rev 4. And this was what the function of Orion 7 was there for, was because basically the ground track moves about 1,300 miles every 90 minutes. And so they had the Orion sitting up at Guam that never got used. Well, not really. Because what happened was, when it came time for him to come fly back home to Patrick Air Force Base, he got a special notice. It says, "Hey, we've got this box of rocks that we need to have you fly and drop off at Huntsville." And so he says, "You can't let them out of your sight." And so, yeah, I talked to him the other night. He was in a mission controller on the back end of the airplane. He says, "So I sat next to the lunar rocks for 11 hours all the way back to Huntsville." So yeah, you call, we haul. And, yeah.
When a spacecraft's in orbit,
yeah.
What percentage of time were you out of contact with that spacecraft?
Oh, there were still significant, particularly if there wasn't anything, if they were just riding along at the time. They were always doing, in many cases, they were doing experiments, even even though they were going to the moon. But generally, I would say we could provide coverage out for our entire orbit if we had to, but particularly if the airplanes were spread out. I would say that generally we could probably cover about 80%. Yeah, I mean between the ground stations and because they keep in mind they had ground stations in Guam and in Hawaii. They had them in Ascension Island down in the South Atlantic. I think they had one in Mauritius or Tenerife, Madagascar. Anyway, but a lot of them. There were about 5 that were across the southern United States too that did that. But then, like I say, they had the ships out there. The Vanguard would always was based out of Port Canaveral, and that one would go up into the Mid-Atlantic. And then the Redstone was based out of Pearl Harbor, and they would move that down to where they needed it. And then we had the Mercury out of Sydney. So they could provide a pretty good coverage, but there was an awful lot of gaps out there that they didn't have. To finish up your question, because I didn't, during the recovery, we had them flying out of Nandi and the Fiji Islands and Pango Pango, American Samoa. Because typically what we would do is when the spacecraft would come in out of blackout, we had 3 Orion that were flying. There was one that was 250 miles uprange, 250 miles downrange, and then there's one in the middle. And it was the one in the middle that was the prime receiver. And once he had the signal and they got it stabilized, he would set up basically a racetrack pattern about 60 miles in diameter, and then just focus his antenna and just run around the circle so he could provide coverage 100% of the time until they splashed down or got within the recovery forces.
There's a question over there.
Yes.
Sorry, how did you relay the comms back to Houston and Cape Canaveral, and what was the round trip time?
Round trip time is about the speed of light. But no, I don't know. But basically from Cape Canaveral it did go out by landline up to Goddard, and from Goddard it went primarily by landline down to Houston, and then would go back that way too.
From the aircraft though, back to
from the aircraft, like I say, it was pretty much there was virtually no delay. It's just that it was, like I say, it was the speed of what it took to cover the distance.
But in terms of the switching and everything, Goddard was the comms network center. So everything went through Goddard, and Goddard sent it to Houston.
Yeah, and everything was analog, so.
Yeah, but so basically it was pretty much, it was pretty much the astronauts would speak and come in through the nose of the airplane, out through the long wire. Now, what happened was, but we also evolved. The planes evolved. During Apollo 13 was the first time we used a satellite. We used the voice for satellite, or the satellite for Apollo 13 voice contact. Then in Apollo 14, they decided they would try using it to retransmit digital data, the data itself. And on Apollo 14, they were tasked with providing relaying the biomedical channels from the spacecraft, and it came into the plane, went up by satellite and brought down in Houston, and the data was so pure, I think they said it dropped 1 bit in a billion, that they actually used it to drive the biomedical computers at Houston. And I suspect, I haven't got it on firm, but I'd be suspect, having tested the voice and the digital over 2 missions, I would think from 15 on, we were no longer using high frequency because we had the access to the satellites. And so, yeah, we evolved, the airplanes evolved. Now, the interesting part is that although the airplanes were developed for Project Apollo, we were used for many, many different projects, some scientific, some military, some for government agencies, some for commercial agencies. We were, guns for hire. The fact is that we brought the first plane up was a test on Apollo 4, and it proved concept because in addition to being a all-up test on the Saturn V, when the capsule re-entered, it was broadcasting a 5 kilohertz beam, and they had one of our airplanes out there to record it just to see as a proof of concept would the darn thing work, and it did. So we brought on the other 7 airplanes in the next couple of months. But one that we brought in January of 1967 was flying missions until it flew into retirement in 2000. Wow. And it's sitting out at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And so, all in all, we covered about 53 different projects. I mean, everything from Skylab and, in fact, actually, on the first space shuttle mission, there was a problem with the communications. And I don't know what the problem was, but I do know that we had an Araya out flying, technically out supporting a military launch out in the Pacific. And they got hold of it, and they says, we need to have you go and cover this space shuttle problem. And so they redeployed. They says, here's where we want the airplane, and while you're flying there, we need to have you reconfigure it like this. And they reconfigured the whole receiving system all en route. So like I say, they really got their money. I'll tell you, they really got their money in $1968. Yes, sir.
So how long could a mission last?
Our missions could be pretty long. The aircraft had a range of about 3,500 miles, and so you could go 10, 12 or more hours. In fact, actually, one mission on Apollo 9, they had us fly 2,000 miles out of Pago, American Samoa, headed to the southeast. And at that point, if you keep going straight, you're going to pass right between Antarctica and Tierra del Fuego. So they got there for 10 minutes and the astronauts were asleep. But the only place they could land was Papeete, Tahiti, because it was only 1,500 miles away. So yeah, like I say, we flew to all the exotic spots. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about Apollo 9 because I imagine that your planes were going pretty much all the time during that one because it was just orbiting the Earth.
Well, that was one of the challenges, particularly of running the pre-pass checklist when you've got 5 or 6 airplanes and they're all in the air at the same time, and you've got checkpoint. You've got the planes are spaced about 5 or 15 or 20 or 45 minutes apart, and you've got a checklist for every one of them. I'll tell you, one arm paper hanger had nothing on me. But we had a couple of other advantages at the time when the astronauts flew from Houston to Cape Kennedy, for whatever reason. They would park their planes right outside our building, and NASA would bring down red Corvettes and park them there so they could have them to drive. And they'd come in and change their flight suits. And although the rules that we had where you couldn't ask for autographs and pictures, doesn't mean you couldn't talk to them. And so we actually had a chance to meet many of the astronauts as they were passing through our building. I had one occasion where actually we also do VIPs, you know, and I remember before, it was before, I think it was before Apollo 11, I think it was after Apollo 10, either that or just before Apollo 10, we briefed Prince Philip of England. And as things would go, he was in the briefing room, which was down the hall from the control center, and the briefing was running long, and I was in charge of the automation that we'd put together, and I had to go take a whiz. And the problem is, I didn't know, the men's room was right down next to the briefing room. So finally I says, okay, well I gotta go. So I start through the door and wham! And I get back and I look and stripe, 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 stripe. I can literally say I bumped into Prince Philip. And so I said, well, excuse me. So he says, no, excuse me, Sergeant. So I said, well, I'll take you into the control center. So I did, and then we got on. But anyway, yeah, we had everything was. But I will say this much, and I think you can appreciate it, particularly those who have been working on the cubes. I understand you're working with cubes. That's good. The concept that project. I mean, everything always looks so smooth. It's like the duck on water. I'll tell you what. Underneath that water, it was like a washing machine. There were so many people scrambling. Now, I don't want to disabuse anybody of something, but here's the cruel, hard facts. NASA, for all of their smarts, and I kid you not, they would literally have everything planned out to the minute. The minute that rocket lifted off, it started the ground elapsed time clock, the get clock. And every minute of that was planned until something happened that wasn't planned. Well, no, but the reason is this. I think you're all familiar that because of a faulty switch, a switch in the wrong position at Goldstone, Honeysuckle Creek got to do the pictures of Neil Armstrong stepping onto the moon. Okay, well what happened was Goldstone was primed for landing. They had their prime crew on. Hey, they were through, so they'd done their job. They left. They had the number 3 crew on. And, well, heck, the moonwalk had been planned. They were going to rest for 4 hours or 5 hours and then do the walk, and that was going to be strictly Honeysuckle Creek. But all of a sudden, Neil Armstrong, now you figure as much as they're planning, they could completely forget human nature. Put yourself in Armstrong's position. You fly 240,000 miles, you land on the moon. Other than take a whiz, what's the first thing you're going to want to do? Is get out and walk. Well, he did. But therein ran the problem, because automatically everything, the whole timeline for that moonwalk shifted forward 5 hours. And because they had the video switch in the wrong position at Goldstone, because the number 3 guy had forgotten it. That's why the very first pictures that came out were basically overexposed and upside down, because he didn't have the switch in the right position. And so right away at Houston, because there's overlap between these stations, and it wasn't a complete cutoff, there was about an hour or so overlap. Both Honeysuckle Creek and Goldstone had the same picture and the same audio and stuff like this. And so the network controller, or whoever at Houston, when they had this screwy picture coming up from Goldstone, they just flipped over the feed to Honeysuckle Creek, and everything cleared up right away. But for whatever reason, while both stations had audio of Neil Armstrong saying "one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," they never switched the audio feed out to the world. And so actually, although both stations had it and both received it, it was Goldstone that transmitted the Neil Armstrong's words to the world. It doesn't mean that Honeysuckle wasn't ready to do it, and they had the thing, but for whatever reason, I don't know why, and it's one of these mysterious things. They switched the video, but they didn't switch the audio, and so that's one of these. It's going to be a myth that Honeysuckle transmitted both of them. But it's unfortunate. It didn't work that way. But that's what goes on behind the scenes. That's what goes on behind the scenes. the question? If not, it's been thank you very much for letting me speak on such an impromptu basis. And I'll be glad to answer any questions.
I just want to, on behalf of everyone here, thanks Dan very much. Thanks Dan very much for making the time available. I was just chatting to him over the weekend, and as soon as I just happened to mention this Monday night, I could barely stop him from coming. So, and he only arrived from Canberra by train at 6:30 tonight. The Space Association of Australia has presented you with this lovely book of Australia in Space by Kerry Doherty. That is the definitive history of Australia in space, and you will enjoy that. He's met Kerry, he knows Kerry, but that is a really good read. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you very, very much for making the time available.
How do you top that?
How do you top that? Well, you can
How do you top that? What was I doing at Apollo 11?
All right, so we're ready to go. Just got to get this back up.
Wait a second.
Yeah, that was a pretty amazing talk, I must say.
Just wait a second.
A year or so ago, we had Jerry Griffin here with Charlie Duke, and now Jerry's, flight at Mission Control during Apollo 13, and yet every time you spoke to him, he wanted to talk about the network, the communications network, and he was really quite thrilled about the ships that were going, but he didn't mention the aircraft. But I'm sure if you had got him going, he was, yeah.
Well, we were 1/3 of their network. You would think that he might have mentioned it.
Oh, we didn't have a lot of time to talk to him, but hey, that was pretty good. Anyway, thank you. That was excellent. All right. I'm Angelo de Grazia, Space Association, of course, and this is my news report. Now let's have a look here. I'm going to race through this because I don't know how much time I've got. Michael, we'll just go. Go. All right. Not working. Not working. Hang on.
Test.
Is it working? No.
Wait a second. I'll turn it down.
Testing. Are we going? Are we going? Yep. Ash, ready to go. Okay, here we go. Of course this doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Michael.
We can put a man in the moon, we can't make
That's all right. We had this ceremony yesterday and the microphones wouldn't work. Dud? Is it going? Hopeless.
Yes,
no? No, not happening.
It's not plugged in.
Did you used to play some golf?
That's D team, I think. D team. D team. Okay, we'll start off with Australian space. 1 year old. Fantastic. So that's a great achievement, and I must say, much to my surprise, they've done a pretty reasonable job. Of course, the space community want them to have more money. And one of the statistics there, which is quite interesting, because they've received $30 million over 4 years. Excuse, that really is 30 million, not 300, or a billion. So it's pretty minuscule to be really truthful. By comparison, the National Gallery receives 46 million a year. So we got a lot of work to do. Okay, let's talk Rocket Lab now. I knew that we had ACRUX here, but that's the Electron rocket that launched out of New Zealand, and of course it launched ACRUX-1. And we mentioned this last time, but congratulations to the team. That's a great effort. Fair dinkum. I was building cardboard rockets at your age, and you're putting them up there. Great effort. And there it is. Okay, let's talk NASA. US space policy. Always good to talk about that. President Trump predicted America would land humans on Mars someday soon. So there you go. In his recent 4th of July speech, Trump, after noting the anniversary that was coming up in the presence of Gene Kranz, mind you, he said, Gene, I want you to know that we're going to be back in the moon very soon, and someday soon we will plant the American flag on Mars. Trump also mentioned Gus Grissom and Buzz Aldrin in the address. His comments came less than a month, if you all recall, when he made that tweet where he criticised NASA for overemphasising the moon. Quite an interesting turn of events. But there he is, with the two gentlemen from Apollo 11 on either side.
The head in the background behind the lady is Neil Armstrong's son, Rick.
Oh, is Rick there? Okay. He's next to Pence, is he?
No, he's next to Mike Collins.
Behind that lady in the blue.
Oh, yeah. That's Rick. Okay, excellent. All right. Bit of a shake-up also. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said that Bill Gerstenmaier, Associate Administrator, who a lot of you would know, he's the guy with the moustache in the middle, and Bill Hill, who's the guy on the right, they basically were moved to as special advisors to other positions. The former shuttle astronaut Ken Bowersox got the Gerstenmaier position, and they're still looking. Acting, is he?
It's just acting. When people are moved to special positions sideways, that doesn't sound like a promotion.
It was certainly not a promotion. And the next slide just basically says, not long after this, Bridenstine later said that the urgency in getting humans back to the moon by 2024 led him to make those changes. Bridenstine said NASA didn't have a lot of time to waste. God, I don't know if that's a bit of a criticism, but I heard the rumour that really, despite the fact that the SLS is so far behind in its program, they were probably saying, no, we cannot get to the moon in 2024. And that's not what the administration wants to hear. So I think that's part of the side shift. It may be a good thing, but the verdict will be out. Okay, moving on. And this is the interesting bit that's come up over the month. Of course, we've got our two commercial providers, i.e. SpaceX and Boeing. And at the Boeing camp, I put this slide up last time. This is their schedule. They're looking at doing in September, they're looking at doing the sort of demonstration mission 1 version that SpaceX did not some time ago. And they were talking about doing that in September. I haven't heard that they're really going exceptionally well in that, so I'd be doubtful that they can do it. They might, but it looks like they won't be flying the operational mission or the manned version until probably in the new year. So Americans still relying on the Russians for a lift to their space station. Interesting. And there it is, their Starliner, CST-100, sitting on top of the Atlas. And SpaceX. Now, this was the DM-1 mission. Very, very good mission. And this is the DM-2 crewed mission that was going to go up this year. They're the two astronauts. And then all of a sudden, during a test, they had what they still call an anomaly, where the Dragon spacecraft that I think it was at landing zone 1, was sitting there, and they were just simulating launch aborts and firing the Dracos and the Super Dracos, and it blew up. But I will talk about this. But it just destroyed the capsule. I won't go into a lot. This is the explanation, but rather than me read the explanation, I'll show you a video. This is good. And those who know Scott Manley...
it's Scott Manley here. It's been a couple of months since SpaceX had their unfortunate anomaly where the Dragon 2 capsule was destroyed during a test of the Super Draco thrusters. Since then, we haven't had very much information. There was that very unofficial and very potato quality video that was leaked. But official updates were thin on the ground until yesterday, when SpaceX issued a press release announcing that they were pretty sure they figured out exactly what went wrong. Now, you can read it on their website, or you can watch me try to explain it in words that most people can understand. So the anomaly occurred during a test of the thrusters on the recovered capsule. It had gone to the space station and then had recovered, and so they wanted to run a complete test on everything. Well, they fired the Draco thrusters successfully, but then when they went to turn on the high-pressure Super Draco thrusters that were used in the abort system, things went wrong. On one side of the capsule, the helium pressurant leaked out explosively, and the oxidizer then followed, starting a fire. To explain exactly how this happened, we have to look at the plumbing of the Super Draco thrusters, and I have some helpful graphics here for you, rendered in full 1080p HD resolution in Microsoft Paint. The Super Draco thrusters are 3D printed bipropellant pressure-fed engines. That means that it has a fuel and an oxidizer which is forced into the engines by gas pressure from a helium tank. The chamber pressure on the Super Dracos is about 60 atmospheres, which means you need quite a high pressure helium tank to push the fuel and oxidizer through. The anomaly happened just before engine ignition. The helium valve had been opened to pressurize the system, but the oxidizer and fuel valves had not yet opened, and therefore fuel wouldn't be flowing into the engine. Now, these valves open and close according to command, but there's another pair of valves in there that are very important. These are automatic check valves. They only allow fluid to flow in one direction. This is critically important because you don't want your liquids flowing back into your gas section. At least it might cause burping as the gas flows through the system. Even worse, the piping in the gas system is titanium typically, and whereas the piping in the fuel and oxidizer system is likely to be stainless steel, much more robust against the corrosive fuel. Check valves work based on pressure. When you have fluid flowing in one direction, it pushes the valve open. When the pressure is in the reverse direction, it pushes the valve closed and it stops the flow. However, during the test, something didn't work quite right, and while it was either with fuel was being loaded, or while it was just sitting around with oxidizer in the tanks, some of that began to leak backwards through the check valve. Now, this is actually not unprecedented, but anyway, that would leak through and it collected at a low spot in the helium piping. So when the helium valve was opened and the helium began to flow through the system, in the oxidizer loop it encountered this blob of fuel which was blocking the pipe. And when that high pressure helium encountered that, it pushed it along the pipe exactly like a bullet is pushed down the barrel of a gun. There are actually high powered air rifles that aren't nearly as high pressure as this helium system. And helium, because of its lower atomic mass, actually moves things even faster. It takes milliseconds for that blob of oxidizer to wind its way through the system and run into that one-way check valve with the force of a bullet. Not only is the momentum and kinetic energy enough to shatter the valve components, but because dinitrogen tetroxide is a highly oxidizing material, and because some of the metals in the system are combustible, this actually starts a metal fire. So the pipe ruptures and a fire is started. Once it gets started, titanium burns very, very well. Now, what we saw in that leaked video was initially the side blowing off and a cloud of high-pressure helium coming out. The helium is a thing that is pressurized, it's moving fast. The fuel and oxidizer system, those haven't been properly pressurized, so those will come out, but they will come out a lot more slowly. It only takes a few seconds, though, because you've got this fire and you've got a lot of high-energy events. And once that starts leaking, you have a fire already, and it will burn using not just the fuel, but it will also burn using the materials that the capsule is manufactured from. The pressure vessels are coated in carbon fiber. The plumbing may contain titanium. Aluminium of the hull will burn as well under these circumstances. So the good news is that SpaceX have already come up with a fix. NASA is okay with it. They're going to replace these check valves with burst discs. Why didn't they use burst discs in the first place, I hear you ask? Well, burst discs are one-use items and they cannot be tested because they destroy themselves in the process, and SpaceX has historically preferred to have mechanical systems that can be tested repeatedly. And, you know, when we're talking about testing, I think it would have been fun to be on the team that tried to figure out how they would burn titanium and various other things. Also, amusingly, there were survivors. The Super Draco thrusters that were initially blamed, those survived just fine, which, you know, for all the people that criticise 3D printing, it seems to have worked just fine with the Super Draco thrust chambers. Anyway, this failure brought to mind an old spacecraft called Mars Observer. That they lost contact with it as it was about to perform a thruster burn on its way to Mars. And while obviously there was no evidence or materials to recover, the investigation board concluded that the most likely explanation for the loss of contact was that nitrogen tetroxide had leaked past the check valve into the pressurization system and either reacted with titanium or caused some other problem that ultimately ruptured the pipes and caused the loss of the spacecraft. Anyway, with the burst disk change, SpaceX are confident that they can fly their in-flight abort in the next few months, and they're holding on to some hope that they might actually launch a crew to the space station before the end of the year, but a lot of that will also depend on not just them getting their spacecraft together, but also there being a slot available in the space station's very busy parking management. So we hope to see Dragon 2 fly soon. Until then, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.
There you go. Yeah, that was pretty amazing. But at least they know. Pretty unlikely though that they will fly end of the year, but we will see a in-flight abort. And what they'll do is the one that was the capsule that was meant for demonstration mission 2 will now become the flight abort article and demonstrate. And actually, the first commercial flight after DM2 will now become the manned test flight to the space station. So there you go. Let's talk Space Launch System. There it is. And there's Orion, sits on top of it. And NASA has now awarded the contract to build the second mobile launch platform. It was awarded to Bechtel and for $383 million. Quite a staggering number there, but it'll be a 44-month project, and it will be designed for the larger Block 1B version of the SLS. And the reason why they've done it is really so that they don't have to refurbish the current mobile launcher, which would take time and put pressure on the launch schedule. And there it is. This was the recent rollout that they did to Pad 39B. And this is the first version, SLS Block 1, which looks like launching probably, they want it to go up next year, but it might be the year after, unfortunately. It's still being delayed. And this is the Block 1B that would get Americans back on the moon. So we'll see what happens. You've seen this flight profile for what's now called Artemis 1, which is the first flight they were hoping next year, but will probably be 2021. They actually had the Ascent Abort 2 test. That was very successful. It was a refurbished Peacekeeper booster carrying a boilerplate Orion and its launch abort system. It was launched to an altitude of nearly 10 kilometers at a speed of Mach 1.3, and then the system was triggered, the abort system was triggered, and we'll see the results of that. That was the kind of flight profile, nothing special. NASA did come under a lot of criticism of not having a parachute on the boilerplate Orion capsule, but there you have it, they didn't do it, but we will see the launch.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition. And this is the LT Minotaur launch vehicle is carrying the AA-2 launch abort system for a full express test.
smart launch abort system. It's not the 1969 version.
Aboard this easy. Pyros 1 and 2 discharge both sides.
Good chamber pressure.
Good control.
We'll do some loops. There it goes. There you have it. Notice the boost or the launch escape system coming down and the capsule's coming down on its own. Alright, I'll keep going. You'll see the booster coming down. Actually quite stable. If you actually see the movie of this, it's actually quite stable as it hits the water. And there it is. Somewhere near Jetty Park, I suspect. At the entry of the Port Canaveral. And there it is, which I thought, wow, look at the stability on that thing. Brilliant. Obviously for its conical shape. CG would be plenty forward. So, based on that, of course, NASA is saying, yeah, of course we'll get to the moon by 2024. So they were very optimistic and upbeat about it. And of course, to back that up, yes, the Artemis flight hardware, and I showed this last time, is well progressed. A lot of work has been done. They're now testing at Marshall, the stress testing of the core stage, and then they will still run what was called the green test, where they'll get the full stack with the 4 space shuttle engines down at Stennis and fire those. So we look forward to that. That's reminiscent of the old Saturn V, first stage firings. And that moves us because that is the rocket that will take us back to the moon. We talk about lunar exploration. NASA has actually, last meeting they'd awarded the contracts to 3 companies, Astrobotics, Intuitive Machines and Orbit Beyond, and they've actually picked some payloads that are going to start, scientific payloads that are going to go back to the moon. They include things like small rovers, robotic arms, cameras, various other instruments. So it's all happening, and we're due to actually start to see some of these flights starting next year. So it'll be terrific. And by the way, if I don't get to it, but the Indians about an hour and a half ago launched Chandrayaan-2, which is their lunar lander and rover. So obviously we wish them luck. The more the merrier. And these are the companies. And the Artemis program, again, the costs. The costs are going to be the killer here. The devil's in the detail. And if you recall, Jim Bridenstine mentioned a number in the order of $20 to $30 billion to really get them back to the moon. How they're going to get that funding is beyond me, but they've really got an uphill battle to convince the government that that's going to happen. And of course, on the back of that, Bridenstine, based on what Trump had said about you focusing too much on the moon, Bridenstine didn't rule out that maybe we'll get to Mars in 2033. Probably flying a SpaceX rocket, I suspect. Okay, quickly, Planetary. I'm sure that Andrew, I'm not timing, guys. What?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. All right. Very quickly, I'm sure Andrew might talk about this, but great mission. A drone to Titan. The only lament I have is it doesn't get there till 2034 or something. US Air Force, very quickly, they've decided that they want to build a space station. Funny that, it brings me back to the mid-60s. You got it. And they also said, we're going to do experiments and research. Mole was nothing, no such thing, and nor is this thing. This is about the militarisation of space. There's Mole, and God knows what the evolution of that thing will be.
So, is this going to be Trump's Space Force thing?
Oh, God. Well, not to put a blanket over the whole party here, but France has announced they're putting up a Space Force as well. But you've got to remember, they're officially announcing Space Forces, but China and Russia have had them for years. They've been doing this stuff for years. It's just that they don't announce that they've got Space Forces. So, I should finish up, hang on. I just wanted to... Falcon Heavy, the next one we won't see till next year. So that's unfortunate. You know, we thought we'd see a cascading, you know, Falcon Heavies launching every few months. Nope, not the case. There's one in 2020 and there's another one in 2021. And there it is. That was the last mission that was launched. And what was this? They've actually won... I'll finish the SpaceX section. They've won a contract to put up XP, which is a imaging X-ray polarimetry explorer. And the significance of this is that it was going to be launched on a Pegasus, but it turns out that the Falcon Heavy is... the Falcon is actually cheaper. So here you go. Reuse is paying dividends. It really is paying dividends. So I know, Len, we could argue this the whole night, but that's a good step. $50 million and you got yourself a launch. Of course, the last part of this is Starship. At the moment, we've got this thing. Of course, the noses blew off. They were building this at in Texas, Boca Chica, as I say. And I'll come to this. It looked like it suffered a little damage in a static fire that they had last week. It was engulfed with, but it didn't. This is where stainless steel really comes in handy, because it doesn't melt like aluminium and things like that, and it was quite resilient. And the engine, of course, the Raptor engine that they'd put into it, survived as well. And there's, without the nose, that's what it looks like, a souped up water tank. Well, it's a water tank manufacturer that's built this thing. And there it is to scale. It is a huge piece of equipment. And it's worth watching this. This is where they do a static fire of the Raptor. So the engine fired successfully. And then they had some methane burn and a bit more methane than they bargained for, I think. And still puffing. Hang on. Ain't over yet. Whoop. There it goes. Uh-oh. And you'll see this thing here, there's a big spray of water starts firing at the fire. There it is. Anyway, so that was what happened last week. But the good news is they're probably getting ready to fly over the next few days. So with a bit of luck, we're going to see some pretty amazing piece of technology come to life. And of course, this is what ultimately he's building. He's building one of those at Boca Chica in Texas, and he's at Cocoa Beach. He's building another one, and they're both racing to build this. And what's more amazing, Elon Musk announced the other day that this thing might be flying in 3 to 4 months. Now, okay, that's Elon time, so you can double that. But even so, if that starts to fly, probably suborbital to begin with, and then they'll start to, broaden its envelope. And they're talking of maybe even getting one of these things into orbit by the end of the year. If that is the case, that's a phenomenal rate of progress. Again, a lot of the big organisations like NASA, even the Air Force, they've looked at it, but they've pretty much discounted this thing. But if it really happens, and this, they're talking about middle of next year, this whole stack flying, bigger than the Saturn. That's it. Thank you.
And that's it for this month, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, Andrew, Rennie. We robbed him, he gave up his seat.
While the Melbourne Space Program is here, something relevant. But Peter, can you find it for me, please? Go back to the desktop. And it's just one little short video clip here. And while we're waiting for that to come up, just a bit of news. Hayabusa 2 has made its second touchdown on the asteroid, and presumably got another sample. Apollo 11, the first panoramas from Apollo 11 came out in National Geographic way back. And of course many people have had attempts to do that since then. Well, the Johnson Space Center has just published a set of panoramas from all the Apollo landing missions. And one of them shows Neil Armstrong in all his glory, the only photograph of Neil Armstrong in full body ever taken on the moon. And moving on, Mars 2020 now has its wheels ready for flying thing, and the helicopter has been tested and is now ready to be put on the Mars 2020. And skipping Dragonfly, because Angelo's already mentioned it. Chang'e 4 and Yutu are still operating on the moon, on the lunar far side. And the InSight mole, they've taken the cover off to expose the drill and the mole, and they think the mole is jammed in the tube, sort of jammed like that sideways in the tube. So that's the go. Now, can you go down to where it says CubeSat tape measure? It's one of the videos. And just explaining that, the first Australian satellite to be built, but the second to be launched, was built at Melbourne University, as you well know. And for the antenna, one of the charming stories about that is that they went to Stanley tape measures and got some Stanley tape, complete with inches on it. Well, that legacy still survives, and I've got here a video of the antennas being deployed, or antennae being deployed on an American CubeSat in test. So I thought you might appreciate this. You've probably seen it already maybe, but
which one is it, Andrew?
Yeah. Let me put my glasses on. So thank you, folks. It wasn't an ordered presentation. Okay.
This is your folder?
That's my folder here. Just, it's down near the end. Deploy.
Okay.
That's it.
Doesn't say tape measure.
No, I know. Okay, here we go.
Yep.
It's not on screen.
Just hold your horses.
Hold my horses. We haven't got time. We're out of time here, mate.
We can put a man on the moon.
All right.
Fix your little problem and light this candle.
Okay, and now you just thought the surprise. Go back.
Double click it?
No, yes, just play. No, that's it. Okay, here we go. There's the little CubeSat, or small satellite. And they're not Stanley ones though. They're American ones. But you notice it. But they've got centimetres and inches on them, I think. Whatever. Anyway, I just thought you might enjoy that.
There were another two. There were actually another two. Swarm put two other satellites on there. Swarm of that organisation that accidentally launched with the Indian Space Organisation. They launched two more on this launch, and they had tape measures on there for the antenna as well. There you go. Well, man, we should have done that.
Okay. Right. So,
that's it.
Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Andrew gave up his segment tonight. No good to everybody. Put a lot of work into it. Once again, Andrew's radio show is every Wednesday night, 7 p.m. on Southern FM, and it streams live and podcast as well. I'd like to thank everyone for coming on tonight into the winter and things like that. After a big day yesterday as well for many of you. Stan, particularly coming down to Melbourne on a train and coming out to see us tonight. We appreciate that so much, and it's really just wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks, Len, for getting that sorted, the logistics. Angelo, Ashley, the IT guy at the back, Angelo's presentations, and everyone. It's a big team effort here. Hope to see you again next month, which is August the 26th, 7 p.m, right here. Bring your friends, and have a pleasant evening. Safe travel home.